He was London's most feared enforcer, a man who broke bones for a living and never asked why. She was a terrified virgin in a blood-stained wedding dress, hiding in a gutter to escape a monster. One night of forbidden passion changed everything, turning a loyal gangster into the underworld's most wanted traitor. He traded his crown for her life, pitting the city's deadliest families against each other in a final, brutal gambit. Now the firms are burning, the secrets are out, and the only thing left standing is a love that was never supposed to exist. The rain on May 12, 1994, was not a gentle mist. It was a heavy, rhythmic beating against the cobblestones of the alleyway, a cold deluge that sought to wash away the sins of the city, but only succeeded in making them slick and more dangerous. Elias Thorne stood in the mouth of that alley, the orange tip of his cigarette, the only spark of warmth in a world of charcoal and slate. He was 35 years old, but his eyes carried the weight of a century. He was a man of large proportions, built from muscle hardened by a decade of enforcing the will of the Thorne family firm, and his face was a map of old scars and silent regrets. His coat was heavy, soaked through at the shoulders, but he didn't move. He liked the cold. It reminded him he was still alive when so many of his contemporaries were 6 feet under the sod of some forgotten cemetery. He was waiting for a contact who was late, a common occurrence in his line of work, when a flash of white caught his eye deep in the darkness of the passage. It wasn't the white of a discarded newspaper or the pale belly of an alley cat. It was silk, pure, expensive, and entirely out of place. Elias dropped his cigarette, crushing it beneath the heel of his leather boot, and moved with a predatory grace toward the shape. As he drew closer, the silhouette resolved into a woman. She was crouched behind a stack of wooden crates, her hands wrapped around her knees, shivering so violently that her teeth clicked together in a frantic rhythm. She wore a wedding dress, a garment of intricate lace and flowing silk that was now stained with the grime of the London gutters. "You're a long way from the chapel, love," Elias said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the damp air. The woman looked up, and for a moment Elias felt a jolt of something he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't just her beauty, though she was stunning, with skin the color of cream and eyes like bruised violets. It was the sheer, unadulterated terror radiating from her. She looked like a deer caught in the crosshairs of a hunter's rifle. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking, "don't let them find me." Elias scanned the street behind him. It was empty save for the flickering of a dying street lamp and the steady pour of the rain. He didn't ask who they were. In his world, they were always someone bad. He reached out a hand, his large calloused palm appearing massive against the delicate fabric of her sleeve. "I'm not part of your them," Elias said, his tone softening just a fraction. "Come on. You'll catch your death out here." He didn't know why he was doing it. He was a man paid to break bones, not to play the knight in shining armor. But there was something about the way she clung to him as he lifted her up, a desperation that mirrored the hollow space in his own chest, that made him steer her toward his black sedan parked at the curb. They drove in silence through the labyrinth of the city. The wipers slapped back and forth, a metronome for the tension filling the cabin. Elias took her to a safe house he kept in the East End, a place the firm didn't know about. It was a modest flat on the 4th floor of a brick building that smelled of old wood and rain. Inside, the air was stale but dry. Elias clicked on a single lamp, casting long amber shadows across the floorboards. He watched as the woman, who had introduced herself only as Clara, stood in the center of the room. The wet silk of her dress clung to her body, revealing the elegant curves of her frame and the frantic rise and fall of her chest. "I shouldn't be here," she said, looking at the door as if expecting it to be kicked in at any second. "You're safer here than in that alley," Elias replied. He walked to a cupboard and pulled out a bottle of amber liquid and 2 glasses. He poured one and handed it to her. "Drink. It'll stop the shaking." She took the glass, her fingers brushing against his. The contact was electric. Elias felt a heat crawl up his arm, a sharp contrast to the damp chill of his clothes. She took a sip, coughing as the liquid burned its way down, but her eyes never left his. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. Elias leaned against the heavy oak table, crossing his arms. "Maybe I'm tired of seeing things get broken." Clara set the glass down. She moved toward him, her movements hesitant, yet driven by a force neither of them understood. The silence of the room was broken only by the rain drumming against the window pane. When she reached him, she placed her small hand on his chest, right over his heart. He could feel the heat of her palm through his shirt. "I don't want to think about tomorrow," she whispered. "I just want to forget who I am for one night." Elias knew he should push her away. He knew that getting involved with a runaway bride was a recipe for a shallow grave. But when she tilted her head back, her lips parted in a silent invitation, the walls he had built around his heart for 15 years crumbled. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw before tangling in her damp, dark hair. He pulled her closer, the scent of rain and expensive perfume filling his senses. When his lips met hers, it wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision of two souls trying to drown out the noise of the world. He lifted her, her legs wrapping around his waist as the silk of her dress bunched up between them. He carried her to the small bedroom, the only sound the heavy thud of his boots on the rug. He laid her down on the quilt, the white of her dress brilliant against the dark fabric. Elias worked the buttons of his shirt with fingers that felt unusually clumsy. He was a man of violence, but as he looked down at her, he felt a strange urge to be something else. Clara reached for him, her hands roaming over the expanse of his tattooed chest, tracing the jagged scars of his past with a tenderness that made his breath catch. He moved over her, the weight of his body pressing her into the mattress. He was careful, his movements deliberate as he navigated the sea of lace and silk. When his skin finally met hers, the world outside the room ceased to exist. There was only the heat of her skin, the softness of her sighs against his neck, and the desperate rhythm of their hearts. He didn't notice the way she winced slightly, the tiny intake of breath that signaled a threshold being crossed for the very first time. He was lost in the curve of her hip, the arch of her back, and the way her fingers dug into his shoulders as the tension reached its peak. For Elias, it was a release from the darkness of his life. For Clara, it was a frantic escape from a future she couldn't face. The night passed in a blur of shared breath and whispered promises that neither expected to keep. They clung to each other in the dark, two strangers seeking shelter from a storm that was only just beginning. When the first grey light of dawn began to bleed through the curtains, Elias lay awake, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of Clara's shoulders. He felt a peace he hadn't known in a decade, a strange sense of contentment that made him want to stay in that bed forever. He didn't know that she had only wanted to use him as a shield. He didn't know that the white silk on the floor represented a blood debt that would soon come calling. And he certainly didn't know that the young woman sleeping beside him was the most dangerous thing he had ever encountered in the streets of London. Elias closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound of her breathing soothe him, unaware that by the time the sun fully rose on May 13th, 1994, his world would be on fire. The sun on May 13th, 1994, was a pale, sickly thing that struggled to pierce the grey canopy of the London sky. Elias Thorne woke to a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight on his chest. He reached out across the expanse of the mattress, his large, scarred hand searching for the warmth of the woman he had held until the early hours of the morning, but he found only cold, rumpled sheets. Clara was gone. He sat up, the springs of the old bed groaning under his weight. His head throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, a reminder of the whiskey and the emotional upheaval of the previous night. He looked toward the floor. The white silk wedding dress, which had seemed like a fallen cloud in the moonlight, was gone too. Only a single tiny pearl, likely torn from the bodice during their frantic embrace, remained on the rug as proof that she had ever existed. Elias rubbed his face, his stubble rasping against his palms. He felt a strange, hollow sensation in his gut, a feeling he hadn't experienced since he was a boy. It was disappointment, sharp and uninvited. He had spent 10 years hardening himself against such vulnerabilities, yet one night with a stranger in a ruined dress had cracked the casing. He rose and dressed quickly, pulling on his trousers and a fresh black shirt. The flat felt smaller now, the shadows in the corners more aggressive. He didn't linger. He grabbed his keys and descended the stairs, his heavy boots echoing in the narrow stairwell. Outside, the East End was waking up with a surly grumble. The smell of diesel exhaust and frying fat from a nearby cafe filled the air. Elias climbed into his sedan and began the drive toward the firm's headquarters, a nondescript warehouse near the docks known simply as the Ironworks. The city moved around him in a blur of red buses and soot-stained brick. London in 1994 was a place of transitions, caught between its industrial past and a shiny corporate future. But for men like Elias, the rules remained as ancient as the Roman walls. You served the family, you kept your mouth shut, and you never ever let your guard down. When he pulled into the gravel lot of the Ironworks, he immediately sensed that something was wrong. There were too many cars, blacked-out Rovers and Mercedes that belonged to the upper echelon of the Thorn organization. Men in dark suits stood in small clusters, their faces tight, their eyes scanning the perimeter with more than the usual amount of paranoia. Elias stepped out of his car, adjusting his coat. He was met at the door by Mickey, a younger enforcer with a nervous energy that usually grated on Elias's nerves. Today, Mickey looked like he had seen a ghost. "Elias, thank God," Mickey whispered, falling into step beside him. "The old man is in a right state, everyone is." "What happened, Mickey? Did the coppers make a move on the south side?" Elias asked, his voice steady despite the prickle of unease on his neck. "Worse," Mickey said, his voice dropping even lower. "Julian Vane. He was supposed to get hitched yesterday. Big merger, right? Bringing the Vane family and the Italians together. A real peace treaty." Elias felt the air leave his lungs. He slowed his pace, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "And the bride," Mickey said, shaking his head. "She vanished. Right before the vows. Vane is tearing the city apart. He thinks someone snatched her to spite him. He's already put 2 of his own men in the hospital, just for failing to watch the back door of the chapel. He's calling it a blood debt, Elias. He says if he doesn't get her back by the end of the week, he's going to start a war that'll burn every firm from here to the Channel." Elias pushed open the heavy steel doors to the main office. The room was thick with cigar smoke and the low hum of frantic conversations. At the head of a long mahogany table sat Arthur Thorne, a man whose skin looked like yellowed parchment stretched over a skull. He looked up as Elias entered, his eyes cold and calculating. "Thorne," Arthur said, his voice a dry rasp, "you're late." "The rain slowed me down, Arthur," Elias lied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Sit," Arthur commanded. "We've got a problem. Julian Vane is convinced that one of the London firms helped his girl run away. He's looking for someone to blame, and we're the biggest target. I need you to find that girl before Vane's people do. If we find her first, we can hand her over, smooth things over, and maybe even get a favor out of the lunatic." Arthur slid a photograph across the table. Elias felt the world tilt on its axis. The woman in the photo wasn't wearing a tattered dress or shivering in an alley. She was posed in a studio, her dark hair perfectly coiffed, her violet eyes staring into the camera with a haunting sort of resignation. It was Clara. "Her name is Clara Rossi," Arthur continued, oblivious to the internal earthquake Elias was enduring. "Daughter of Leo Rossi. The old man gambled away his stake in the casinos and offered his daughter to Vane to settle the tab. She's 21, never been out of her father's sight until yesterday. A pure prize, or so Vane tells everyone. He's obsessed with the idea that she's unspoiled. If he finds out anyone has even looked at her the wrong way, he'll peel their skin off while they're still breathing." Elias stared at the photo, his mind racing through the events of the previous night. The way she had clung to him, the way she had whispered that she wanted to forget who she was. He remembered the small wince, the intake of breath, and the realization hit him with the force of a lead pipe to the gut. He hadn't just slept with a runaway bride. He had taken the one thing Julian Vane valued more than power. He had taken her innocence. The room seemed to grow darker, the voices of the other men fading into a dull roar. Elias realized that the tiny pearl on his rug wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a ticking time bomb. If Clara was found and Vane's doctors examined her, Elias Thorne would be the most hunted man in the history of the United Kingdom. "Elias," Arthur's voice broke through the fog. "Did you hear me? I want you to start with the transport hubs. Check the stations, the wharves. She couldn't have gone far on foot in that dress." "I'm on it," Elias said, his voice sounding hollow to his own ears. He stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "And Elias," Arthur added, his eyes narrowing, "if you find her, bring her straight to me. Don't let her talk you into anything. Vane is a monster, but he's a monster we need on our side. Understood?" "Understood," Elias repeated. He walked out of the ironworks, the sunlight blinding him for a moment. His mind was a chaotic storm of self-preservation and a strange, protective fury. He knew what Vane was. Everyone in the underworld knew. The man was a sadist who treated women like property to be broken. Elias climbed back into his car, but he didn't head for the train stations. He drove back toward the East End, his hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. He knew he should find her and turn her in. It was the only way to save his own life. It was the logical, professional thing to do. But as he pulled up to his building, he saw a shadow move in the alleyway next to his entrance. His heart leaped into his throat. He parked the car, his hand reaching for the heavy iron tool he kept under the seat, and stepped out. He moved toward the shadow, his pulse thrumming in his ears. As he rounded the corner, he saw her. She was huddled in the same spot, but she had changed into a pair of oversized coveralls she must have stolen from a clothesline. Her face was smudged with soot, and her eyes were wide with a terror that surpassed anything he had seen the night before. "You came back," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant roar of the city. Elias looked at her, and for the first time in his life, he felt the weight of a conscience he thought he had buried years ago. He knew that by standing here, by not calling Arthur Thorne right now, he was signing his own death warrant. "You have no idea what you've done, Clara," Elias said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know," she said, a single tear tracking through the grime on her cheek. "But I'd rather be dead than go back to him. Please, Elias. You're the only person who didn't look at me like a paycheck." Elias looked at the woman who had shared his bed and his secrets, and he knew there was no going back. The blood debt had been recorded, and the collection was about to begin. "Get in the car," Elias commanded, his voice cold and hard. "We're leaving London." He didn't know where they were going, or how they would survive the combined wrath of the Thorne and Vane families, but as he closed the passenger door, he felt a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in 15 years, Elias Thorne wasn't following orders. He was making his own destiny. But the shadows of the wharf were long, and Julian Vane's reach was even longer. As they sped away from the curb, a black car 3 blocks away turned its lights on and began to follow, drifting through the London traffic like a shark in dark water. The fog on May 14th, 1994, rolled in off the Thames like a thick grey shroud, swallowing the skeletal remains of the cranes that lined the royal docks. It was a landscape of rust and forgotten industry, a place where the city's secrets went to drown. Elias Thorne steered the sedan through the iron gates of a derelict shipyard, the tires crunching over broken glass and gravel. He didn't turn on the headlights. He knew this terrain by heart. He had disposed of enough problems here to navigate it blindfolded. Beside him, Clara was a statue of silent anxiety. She had wrapped herself in an old wool blanket Elias kept in the trunk, her small frame swallowed by the heavy fabric. She watched the silhouettes of the abandoned warehouses pass by, her breathing shallow and rhythmic. "We'll stay here," Elias said, his voice cutting through the hum of the engine. "My brother and I used to run booze through this wharf before the firm went legitimate. Nobody comes here anymore. Even the squatters are afraid of the ghosts." He parked the car inside the cavernous belly of warehouse number 9. The air inside was freezing, smelling of salt, ancient oil, and the slow decay of timber. Elias stepped out, his hand instinctively resting on the heavy wrench tucked into his belt, his eyes scanning the rafters. The silence was absolute save for the distant, mournful whistle of a tugboat out on the river. He opened the passenger door and helped Clara out. As her feet hit the concrete, she stumbled, her strength finally failing her. Elias caught her, his large arms encircling her waist. For a heartbeat, they stayed like that, the giant enforcer and the runaway bride, pressed together in the darkness. He could feel the frantic pounding of her heart against his chest, a reminder of the life he was now risking everything to protect. "I'm sorry," she whispered into the lapel of his coat. "I'm so sorry I brought this to your door." Elias didn't answer. He led her toward a small reinforced office in the corner of the warehouse. It was a tiny box of a room, but it had a heavy steel door and a small wood-burning stove. He spent the next 30 minutes moving with a grim efficiency, starting a small fire with old crates and laying out a sleeping bag on a tattered sofa. Once the room began to take on a meager warmth, Elias turned to her. He stood under the flicker of a single battery-powered lantern, his face cast in harsh, jagged shadows. "Now," he said, his tone brooked no argument. "I need the whole story, Clara. No more half-truths, no more forgetting who you are. If I'm going to die for you, I want to know why." Clara sat on the edge of the sofa, the firelight dancing in her violet eyes. She looked smaller than she had in the alley, stripped of the lace and the mystery. "My father is Leo Rossi," she began, her voice trembling. "Everyone thinks he's a king because of the casinos, but he's a slave. He's been gambling with money that wasn't his for years. Julian Vane, he bought up all of my father's markers, thousands and thousands of pounds. When my father couldn't pay, Vane offered him a deal. A marriage," Elias finished for her, his jaw tightening. "A transaction," Clara corrected, a flash of bitterness crossing her face. "I was the payment. Vane didn't want a wife. He wanted a trophy. He wanted the Rossi name to legitimize his filth. He told me that if I didn't go through with it, he would have my father's hands crushed and then he would come for me anyway. He wanted me pure for the wedding night. He talked about it constantly, how he was going to break me in." Elias felt a surge of cold, murderous rage. He had known Julian Vane was a piece of work, but hearing the clinical cruelty of the arrangement made his blood boil. He looked at Clara, at her delicate features and the way she held herself with a quiet, broken dignity, and he thought about the night they had shared. He realized then that her gift to him hadn't been an act of reckless lust. It had been an act of sabotage. She had given him the one thing Vane demanded, so she would never have to give it to the monster. "You used me," Elias said, though there was no malice in his voice. It was a simple observation. Clara looked up, tears blurring her vision. "At first, maybe. I just wanted to be ruined so he wouldn't want me. But then when you touched me, it wasn't what I expected. You weren't a tool, Elias. You were the only person who ever made me feel like I belonged to myself." She rose from the sofa and moved toward him. The heat from the stove was beginning to fill the small space, and the air between them grew heavy. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she unbuttoned the top of his black shirt, her knuckles brushing against the warm skin of his throat. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. Elias looked down at her. He thought about Arthur Thorne, about the blood debt, and the black car that had been trailing them. He thought about the life of luxury and power he was throwing away for a woman he had known for less than 24 hours. "I've spent 15 years doing things that make me want to scrub my skin off with steel wool," Elias said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "Last night was the first time I felt clean." He reached out, his large hands framing her face. His thumbs traced the line of her cheekbones before sliding down to her neck. The physical magnetism between them was undeniable, a raw, primal pull that ignored the logic of their situation. He leaned down, his lips ghosting over hers. The kiss was slow and deep, a desperate search for comfort in the middle of a war zone. Elias's hands moved down her back, pulling her flush against him. He could feel the curves of her body through the rough fabric of her coveralls, the softness of her breasts pressing against his hard chest. The contact was intimate and heavy with a simmering sensuality, a tactile reminder of why they were hiding in the shadows of the wharf. He moved his mouth to her ear, his breath hot. "I'm not letting him have you, Clara. Not while I'm still drawing breath." He pulled back just an inch, his eyes locked on hers. "But you need to understand something. Vane won't stop. He'll burn this whole city to find you. And Arthur? The Thorne family won't protect me once they realize I've betrayed them. We're alone in this." "I know," Clara said, her voice gaining a sudden, surprising strength. "I'd rather die with you in this warehouse than live another second in his world." Elias nodded, a grim smile touching his lips. He turned away to check the window, his mind already spinning with defensive strategies. But as he pulled back the edge of the heavy blackout curtain, his heart froze. Down in the shipyard, Nearly 300 yards away, the fog parted for a brief second. A pair of headlights flickered once, then twice, before being cut. It was a black Rover, idling silently near the gate. They weren't alone. "Get your things," Elias hissed, his voice like a whip. "We have to move now." "What is it?" Clara asked, the terror returning to her eyes. "They found us," Elias said, reaching into the waistband of his trousers and pulling out a silenced pistol he had hidden there. "I don't know how, but they found us." The shadows of the wharf, once their sanctuary, suddenly felt like a cage. Elias realized with a sinking dread that there was a leak in his own organization. Someone he trusted had sold him out to Julian Vane. As they slipped out of the office and back into the dark, echoing expanse of the warehouse, the heavy iron doors at the far end began to creak open. The hunt was no longer a distant threat. It was inside the house. The transition from May 14th to May 20th, 1994, felt like a single, agonizingly long breath held in the dark. They had barely escaped the wharf, Elias driving the sedan through a brick wall of fog, while the rhythmic pop of a silenced firearm echoed behind them. He had burned the car in a scrapyard in Essex and stolen a nondescript blue van, moving them to a basement flat in a quiet, decaying terrace in South London. The neighborhood was the kind of place where people kept their curtains drawn and their business to themselves, a perfect graveyard for two people who weren't supposed to exist anymore. The basement was damp, the walls weeping with condensation, but it was a fortress of sorts. Elias had spent the first 3 days sitting by the door with his weapon across his knees, listening to the footsteps on the pavement above. Every heavy tread was a potential executioner, every passing siren was a countdown. By the time May 20th, 1994 arrived, the immediate terror had settled into a low, vibrating hum of domestic tension. The flat consisted of 2 rooms, a kitchen that smelled of gas and bleach, and a bedroom where the single mattress sat directly on the floorboards. In such a small space, their bodies were constantly in orbit of one another. Elias was a man defined by his perimeter. He had spent his adult life maintaining a distance that allowed him to do his job without the interference of empathy. But Clara was an invasive force. Her presence was everywhere. The scent of her stolen lavender soap in the cramped shower, the soft sound of her humming to herself to drown out the silence, and the way her eyes followed him whenever he moved. "You haven't slept in 48 hours, Clara said, her voice soft as she emerged from the shadows of the kitchenette. Elias sat at the small wooden table, cleaning the components of his pistol. The rhythmic click-clack of the metal was the only thing keeping him grounded. He didn't look up. "I'll sleep when we're out of the city." "We're never getting out, are we?" she asked, stepping closer. He finally raised his gaze. She was wearing one of his oversized white shirts, the hem hitting mid-thigh, her dark hair tumbling over her shoulders in a wild, unbrushed mane. In the dim light of the basement, she looked ethereal and tragically young. "I'm working on it," Elias replied, his voice gravelly from disuse. "I have contacts, people who owe me favors that Arthur doesn't know about, but it takes time to move someone like you. Vane has eyes at every port." Clara walked around the table and stood behind him. He felt the heat radiating from her body before she even touched him. Then her hands settled on his shoulders. Her fingers were small but strong, digging into the knots of muscle that had become as hard as stone. "You're carrying the weight of the whole world, Elias," she whispered. He should have shrugged her off. He should have told her that physical contact was a distraction he couldn't afford. But as her thumbs traced the base of his skull, a shudder ran through his massive frame. The fragile shield he had built around himself wasn't just intended to keep Vane out. It was intended to keep his own humanity in. And it was failing. He reached up, his large hand covering hers, pressing it more firmly against his skin. The contrast was stark, his knuckles scarred and thickened by violence, her skin as smooth and delicate as fine porcelain. "I did this to myself," Elias said, turning in the chair to face her. "No," Clara said, her violet eyes locking onto his. "You did this for me. There's a difference." The air in the basement grew thick, the oxygen seemingly replaced by a magnetic pull that neither of them could resist. The tension that had been building since that first night in the East End reached a boiling point. It was a raw, visceral need born from the knowledge that they were living on borrowed time. Clara leaned forward, her lips grazing his forehead before sliding down to his cheek. Elias let out a ragged breath, his hands finding her waist. He pulled her between his knees, his grip firm as he navigated the softness of her body. The white shirt she wore was thin, and he could feel the curve of her hips and the frantic rhythm of her heart. He stood up, towering over her, and his hands moved up to frame her face. He kissed her then, a desperate, hungry collision that tasted of salt and narrow escapes. Clara responded with a ferocity that matched his own, her arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him down into her world. He lifted her easily, his muscles straining against the fabric of his shirt as he carried her the few steps to the mattress. He laid her down, the old floorboards groaning beneath them. The light from the street lamp outside filtered through the high, barred window, casting a grid of shadows across her skin. Elias moved with a deliberate, heavy grace. He stripped away the layers of his own defense, his tattoos, the anchors, the thorns, the names of the dead, visible in the half-light. Clara reached for him, her hands roaming over his chest, her touch light and curious as if she were memorizing the geography of a man who was willing to die for her. When their bodies finally met, it was with an intensity that surpassed the night of the wedding. It wasn't just about release, it was about confirmation. Every touch, every shared breath was a way of saying, I am still here. You are still here. Elias was mindful of his strength, his movements slow and powerful, his skin slick with heat against hers. He lost himself in the arch of her back, the way her breath hitched when he kissed the sensitive skin of her throat, and the way she clung to him as if he were the only solid thing in a collapsing universe. In the aftermath, they lay tangled together under a thin grey blanket. The silence of the basement felt different now, less like a cage and more like a sanctuary. Elias watched the shadows dance on the ceiling, his arm draped over Clara's shoulders, her head resting on his chest. "What happens if they find us tomorrow?" she asked, her voice a tiny thread in the dark. "Then tomorrow will be a very bad day for them," Elias replied, his voice regaining its hard edge. But as he spoke, he couldn't shake the image of the Black Rover at the wharf. Someone had known exactly where he was going. He had been a part of the Thorn firm for 15 years, and he knew how they operated. They didn't just guess. They tracked. His mind drifted to Mickey, his second in command. Mickey was young, ambitious, and far more observant than he let on. He had seen Mickey's eyes when Elias left the ironworks on May 13th. There had been a flicker of doubt there, a calculation that Elias had dismissed at the time. If Mickey was the leak, then the shield wasn't just fragile, it was already shattered. Elias waited until Clara's breathing became deep and rhythmic, signaled by her total surrender to sleep. He slipped out of the bed, his movements silent, and walked to the small window. He stared up at the street level, watching the tires of a passing car roll by. He knew he couldn't stay in London. The city was a trap and the walls were closing in. He needed a way out, and he needed it before the Thorn family decided that their loyal enforcer had become a liability that needed to be liquidated. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper with a phone number written in ink that was beginning to fade. It was a contact in the docks of Liverpool, a man who didn't ask questions if the price was right. But as he moved toward the rotary phone on the wall, he heard a faint sound from the street above. It wasn't the sound of a car or a pedestrian. It was the distinct metallic snick of a car door being closed, with practiced quietness. Elias froze, his hand hovering over the receiver. He didn't breathe. 2 seconds passed. Then 4. Then 6. He moved to the door, his pistol already in his hand. He pressed his ear to the wood. Above him, on the stairs leading down to the basement, he heard the floorboard groan. It was a sound he knew well, the sound of a man trying to be invisible. The shield was gone. The war had followed them to the south side. He looked back at the bed where Clara was still sleeping, her face peaceful in the dim light. A wave of protective fury crashed over him. He wasn't going to let them take her. He wasn't going to let the world turn her back into a transaction. He reached down and shook her shoulder, his voice a sharp, urgent whisper. "Clara, wake up. They're here." The sky over London on May 25th, 1994, was the colour of a fresh bruise. Elias Thorn stood by the attic window, his silhouette a jagged shadow against the fading light. He watched a black sedan crawl slowly down the street, its headlights off like a predator sniffing the air. He knew that car. He knew the man behind the wheel. The Thorne family wasn't just looking for a runaway bride anymore. They were looking for a traitor. Clara sat on a crate in the corner, her knees pulled to her chest. The oversized shirt she wore was wrinkled, and her face was pale, but the terror that had once paralyzed her had been replaced by a sharp, desperate alertness. "How did they find us?" she asked, her voice a mere thread in the silence. "A wiretap," Elias said, his voice flat. "Or a tail I didn't spot. But I think it was Mickey. He was always too good at counting the bullets I didn't use." Just as the words left his lips, the pager on his belt vibrated. He pulled it out, squinting at the small digital screen. A code. A summons. It was Arthur Thorne's personal signal for a neutral meeting at a pub in the East End called the Blind Beggar. In their world, neutral usually meant a single bullet to the back of the head while you were reached for your pint. "I have to go," Elias said. Clara stood up, her movement sudden and panicked. "It's a trap, Elias. You know it is." "Of course it's a trap," Elias replied, turning to face her. He walked across the small room, his heavy boots silent on the dusty floorboards. He reached out, his large hands gripping her shoulders. He could feel the fine tremors running through her. "But if I don't go, they'll keep turning over every stone in this city until they find you. If I can talk to Arthur, if I can buy us one more night." "Don't," she whispered, stepping into the circle of his arms. She pressed her face against his chest, her hands clutching at the fabric of his dark jacket. The warmth of her body was a stark contrast to the chill of the room. "I can't lose the only thing that's real." Elias tilted her chin up. The physical pull between them was an ache now, a heavy, pulse-pounding necessity. He leaned down, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that tasted of copper and goodbye. It was a deep, lingering contact, her softness yielding to his strength, their breath hitching in unison. For a few seconds, the threat outside the door ceased to exist. There was only the heat of her skin and the desperate rhythm of their shared heartbeat. "Stay away from the windows," Elias commanded, breaking the kiss but keeping his forehead pressed against hers. "If I'm not back by the time the moon hits the chimney stack across the street, take the money in the lining of my coat and head for the docks." He didn't wait for her to argue. He turned and slipped out of the room, the door clicking shut with a finality that echoed in his gut. The Blind Beggar was nearly empty when Elias arrived. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale ale and cheap tobacco. Arthur Thorne sat in a booth at the far back, a glass of dark stout in front of him. Beside him stood Mickey, his hands folded in front of his waist, his expression unreadable. Elias sat down across from Arthur. He didn't order a drink. "You've been hard to find, Elias," Arthur said, his voice a dry rasp that sounded like dead leaves skittering on pavement. 15 years of service, and you vanish over a girl who belongs to a man who could end us all with a phone call." "She doesn't belong to anyone, Arthur," Elias said, his hand resting on the table, fingers twitching near the concealed blade in his sleeve. "Julian Vane says otherwise," Arthur countered. He leaned forward, the yellowed light of the pub catching the wrinkles around his cold eyes. "He's offered a bounty, Elias, a large one. But more importantly, he's offered peace. All we have to do is give him the girl and the man who spoiled her. He was very specific about that part. He knows, Elias. He knows what you did that night on May 12th. Elias felt a cold drip of adrenaline hit his stomach. "Who told him?" Mickey stepped forward, a smug, thin smile touching his lips. "It wasn't hard to figure out, boss. You were the only one missing from the roster that night. And the girl, she wasn't exactly quiet about who she was running with." "You sold me out for a promotion, Mickey?" Elias asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low rumble. "I sold you out for survival," Mickey replied. Arthur sighed, a sound of mock regret. "I'm sorry, Elias. You were the best enforcer I ever had, but nobody is worth a war with Vane." Arthur gave a slight nod. From the shadows of the bar, 2 more men emerged, their hands reaching into their jackets. Elias didn't wait. He surged forward, his massive shoulder catching the table and flipping it directly into Arthur's lap. In the same motion, he whipped the blade from his sleeve, the steel catching the dim light. He drove his elbow into Mickey's throat, hearing the satisfying crack of cartilage, before spinning to face the 2 gunmen. The pub erupted into chaos. One man fired, the bullet shattering a mirror behind the bar, raining glass down like frozen diamonds. Elias dived behind a heavy oak pillar, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He pulled his own pistol and fired twice. One man went down clutching a shattered knee, his screams filling the small space. Elias didn't stay to finish the fight. He knew more would be coming. He smashed through the stained glass window at the side of the pub, the shards cutting through his jacket as he tumbled onto the wet pavement of the alleyway. He ran. He ran through the labyrinth of the East End, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the metallic taste of blood in his mouth. He could hear the screech of tires behind him, the hunt intensifying. He wasn't just a traitor anymore, he was a dead man walking. By the time he reached the tailor shop, the sky was pitch black. He climbed the fire escape, his muscles screaming in protest. He burst into the attic, his chest heaving, blood dripping from a cut on his temple. Clara was there, her eyes wide with horror as she saw him. She rushed to him, her hands hovering over his wounds. "Elias, you're hurt." "We have to go," he rasped, grabbing his bag and hers. "They know everything. Mickey talked. Vane knows about that night." He looked at her, and for a second, the weight of the betrayal threatened to crush him. He had spent 15 years building a life of power and respect, and in one evening it had been stripped away. He had nothing left but the woman standing in front of him. "We're hunted now, Clara," Elias said, his voice thick with the realization of their new reality. "The Thorn firm, Vane's people, everyone with a gun in this city is looking for our heads." Clara reached out, her fingers brushing the blood from his brow. Her touch was steady, her violet eyes filled with a fierce, unexpected resolve. "Then let them look. We're not the same people they're hunting." Elias nodded, a grim, dark fire igniting in his soul. He took her hand, his large fingers entwining with hers, and led her toward the back exit. They descended into the shadows of the London night, no longer hiding in the corners, but moving with the desperate purpose of those who have nothing left to lose. As they reached the street level, a black car turned the corner 2 blocks away, its searchlight cutting through the fog like a cold, accusing eye. The city had become a battlefield, and the first shot of the final war had just been fired. The rain on May 30th, 1994, was a relentless icy deluge that felt like a million tiny needles against the skin. Elias Thorne and Clara Rossi were huddled in the rusted skeleton of a dry dock in the southern reaches of the river. The air was thick with the scent of stagnant water, wet iron, and the sharp metallic tang of blood. Elias sat against a concrete pillar, his breath coming in shallow, wheezing rattles. The wound from the pub had reopened, and a new gash from a stray piece of shrapnel was weeping dark red into the fabric of his shirt. They had spent the last 5 days moving through the city like ghosts, sleeping in 4-hour shifts in stolen vans and abandoned garages. The weight of the world was pressing down on Elias's shoulders, his face a mask of exhaustion and grim determination. He looked 45 instead of 35, the lines around his eyes etched deep by the constant threat of a bullet in the dark. Clara knelt beside him, tearing a strip of fabric from her own shirt to bind the wound on his side. Her hands were steady, but her face was ashen. She looked at him, at the man who had traded his life, his reputation, and his future for hers, and a crushing guilt began to take hold of her heart. "You can't keep doing this, Elias," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the rain against the metal roof. Elias looked at her, his violet-hued eyes clouded with pain. "Doing what?" "Dying for me," she said, her voice cracking. "Look at you. You're bleeding out in a shipyard while 2 of the most powerful men in London hunt you like a dog, all because I didn't want to marry a monster." "I told you," Elias rasped, his hand reaching out to cover hers. His palm was hot, feverish. "I'm not letting him have you." Clara leaned into him, her forehead resting against his shoulder. The physical connection was their only anchor. She could feel the heat of his body, the hard muscle of his chest, and the frantic, heavy thud of his heart. The sensuality of their bond had evolved into something more profound, a desperate, tactile necessity. She slid her hands under his coat, pressing her palms against his chest, trying to share her warmth with him. "Elias, listen to me," she said, pulling back to look him in the eye. "I'll go back. I'll tell Julian that you kidnapped me, that you forced me to stay. If I go back voluntarily, he might let you live. He gets his trophy, and you get to keep breathing." Elias's grip on her hand tightened until it was almost painful. "No." "It's the only way," she cried, the tears finally breaking through. "I was a virgin, Elias. He wanted that purity to feed his ego, and I gave it to you to spite him. But I won't let my spite kill you. The price of my innocence isn't your life." Elias pulled her toward him, his movements slow and agonizing. He wrapped his massive arms around her, burying his face in her hair. The scent of her, the lavender soap long gone, replaced by the smell of rain and grit, was the only thing that felt real. "You think I'm doing this because of what happened that night?" Elias whispered into her ear, his breath hot. "I'm doing this because for 15 years I didn't care if I lived or died. You gave me a reason to want to see the sun come up, Clara. If I give you back to him, I'm just a walking corpse again. I'd rather die in this shipyard as a man than live for another 40 years as a shadow." He kissed her then, a raw, desperate collision of lips and teeth. It wasn't about lust, it was a vow. Clara clung to him, her fingers digging into his back, her body molding to his as if they could fuse together and become invincible. The moment was shattered by the sound of a heavy metal chain rattling at the far end of the dock. Elias reacted instantly. Despite the pain, he surged to his feet, his hand instinctively reaching for the pistol at his waist. He pushed Clara behind the concrete pillar, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Stay down," he commanded. 3 figures emerged from the curtain of rain. They weren't the Thorn enforcers. These men wore the grey tactical gear of Julian Vane's private security. Professionals, not street thugs. They moved with a clinical, lethal precision, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. "Thorn," one of them shouted, his voice amplified by the hollow space. "Give us the girl, and we'll make it quick for you. Vane wants to talk to you before you go, but the girl has to be intact." Elias didn't answer with words. He fired 2 shots, the muzzle flashes illuminating the dry dock for a split second. One man went down, a gurgling cry escaping his throat as he slumped into the oily water at the bottom of the dock. The remaining 2 men returned fire. The dry dock became a cacophony of shattering glass and whining ricochets. Elias moved with a terrifying primal energy, ignoring the agony in his side. He circled around a stack of rusted shipping containers, using the environment he knew so well. He came up behind the second man, a shadow within the shadows. He didn't use his gun. He grabbed the man's throat with one massive hand, the other driving a combat knife upward into the soft tissue beneath the chin. It was a silent, brutal kill. But as the second man fell, the third, the leader, spotted him. A burst of gunfire caught Elias in the shoulder, spinning him around. He hit the ground hard, his pistol skittering across the concrete. The leader stepped forward, his rifle leveled at Elias's head. "Vane was right about you, Thorn. You're a sentimental fool." Clara screamed, stepping out from behind the pillar. "Stop! Don't kill him. I'll go with you." The gunman paused, his eyes flicking to Clara. That half-second was all Elias needed. He lunged forward, grabbing the barrel of the rifle and wrenching it upward as it discharged. He drove his forehead into the man's nose, the crunch of bone echoing in the silence. They tumbled toward the edge of the dry dock, a tangle of limbs and fury. They fell 10 feet into the shallow, muck-filled water at the base. Elias landed on top, his weight and rage fueling his last reserves of strength. He didn't stop hitting until the man beneath him stopped moving. Elias climbed out of the water, shivering violently. He looked up to see Clara standing at the edge of the dock, her face illuminated by the moonlight that was finally breaking through the clouds. She scrambled down the rusted ladder, throwing herself into his arms as he collapsed against the base of the dock. "You're alive," she sobbed, clutching him. "Oh God, Elias." He was covered in mud and blood, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at the bodies of the 3 professionals. Vane had sent his best, and Elias had barely survived. He knew that this was just the beginning. The firm would be next, and they wouldn't come in threes. "We can't stay in the shadows anymore," Elias rasped, his voice thick with blood. "Hiding is just waiting to die." He looked at Clara, his violet eyes burning with a new, dangerous light. "We're going to stop running. If Vane wants a war, I'm going to bring it to his front door. But first, I need to make a phone call. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of coins. On the far side of the shipyard, a lone, graffiti-covered payphone stood under a flickering light. "Who are you calling?" Clara asked, helping him stand. "The only person Julian Vane is afraid of," Ilias replied. "The truth." He leaned on her as they walked toward the light, the rain finally beginning to taper off. The confrontation in the shipyard had been a bloodbath, but it had also been a crucible. Elias Thorne was no longer an enforcer for a firm, and he was no longer a man on the run. He was a man with a target, and for the first time in his life he was fighting for something more than just survival. The transition was complete. The hunter had become the prey, but the prey had just grown teeth. By June 1st, 1994, the wounds on Elias Thorne's body had begun to knit into thick, angry welts, but the fire in his soul had only grown more intense. They were no longer squatting in damp basements or rusted shipyards. Elias had moved them to a luxury penthouse in Canary Wharf, a property held through 3 layers of shell companies and offshore accounts that even Arthur Thorne didn't know existed. It was a glass cage overlooking the winding ribbon of the Thames, where the lights of the city twinkled like cold, distant diamonds. Elias stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his reflection ghostly against the night sky. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than most men made in a year. He had spent 15 years accumulating wealth and power, and he had no intention of walking away empty-handed. He had the resources. Now he just needed the leverage. Clara walked into the room, the silk of a deep emerald robe rustling against her skin. She looked different now. The terror in her eyes had been replaced by a sharp, calculating intelligence. She had seen the man behind the enforcer, and she had realized that their only hope for a future lay in the absolute ruin of their past. She moved toward him, her footsteps silent on the plush rug. She didn't say a word as she reached out, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, before sliding down to the silk tie at his throat. The physical connection between them had become a silent language, a way to anchor themselves in the middle of a hurricane. "You look like the king they're afraid of," she whispered, her voice a low, melodic vibration. Ilias turned, his large hands finding her waist. He pulled her flush against him, the heat of her body seeping through the layers of his suit. He leaned down, his lips grazing the sensitive skin beneath her ear. The contact was heavy with an electric, simmering sensuality. Even with the world crashing down around them, the pull between them was a raw, undeniable force. "I'm not a king, Clara," Elias replied, his voice a gravelly rumble. "I'm the man who's going to burn the kingdom down so we can walk through the ashes." He broke the embrace and walked over to a mahogany desk, where several burner phones lay in a neat row. He had spent the last 48 hours making calls, not to his enemies, but to their ambitions. He had spoken to a contact in the Metropolitan Police who was deep in Arthur Thorne's pocket, and a journalist at a major broadsheet who had been looking for a way to crack the Vane family for a decade. "The play is set," Elias said, his eyes cold. "Arthur thinks I'm meeting him tonight to trade you for my life and a seat at the high table. He's greedy enough to believe I've broken under the pressure. Meanwhile, I've sent word to Julian Vane that Arthur is hiding you in a warehouse in the Docklands, planning to sell you to the Italians to start a new alliance against the Vanes." Clara leaned against the desk, her brow furrowed. "You're pitting them against each other." "I'm giving them exactly what they want," Elias countered. "Arthur wants power. Vane wants his trophy and revenge. By the time they realize they've been played, they'll be too busy killing each other to worry about us." He picked up the final phone and dialed a number he had memorized 10 years ago. It was the personal line of a high-ranking official in the Home Office, a man who had once been caught in a compromising position that Elias had resolved. "It's Thorne," Elias said when the line connected. "The information I promised you regarding the Vane and Thorne money laundering operations is in a locker at Waterloo Station. Key is in the mail. In exchange, I want the ports clear for a private vessel on June 5th. No questions, no interference." He hung up without waiting for an answer. The truth he had spoken of in the shipyard wasn't a moral epiphany. It was a weaponized dossier of 15 years of criminal transactions. The night air was still as Elias prepared for the final confrontation. He checked his sidearm, a heavy black weight against his hip, and ensured the documents were secured. He looked at Clara, who was watching him with a mixture of pride and profound sadness. "If this goes wrong," she started. "It won't," Elias interrupted, moving back to her. He took her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. He kissed her with a slow, deep intensity that tasted of desperation and a promise of something more. "I didn't survive 15 years of this life to lose it all now. Stay here. If you hear from me on the radio, move to the secondary location. If you don't hear from me by dawn, take the jet at Biggin Hill. The pilot has his orders." Clara clung to him for a moment longer, her body trembling slightly against his. "Come back to me, Elias. I don't care about the money or the penthouse. I just want the man." Elias nodded, a grim smile touching his lips. He turned and walked out of the penthouse, the elevator chime sounding like a tolling bell. The meeting point was a decommissioned power station on the banks of the Thames. It was a cathedral of concrete and rusted steel, a place where the shadows felt ancient and hungry. Elias arrived early, positioning himself in the high rafters of the turbine hall. Through his binoculars, he watched the first black sedans pull into the yard. It was Arthur Thorne's contingent, 30 men, heavily armed, looking like a small army. 10 minutes later, a fleet of grey rovers arrived from the opposite direction. Julian Vane stepped out of the lead vehicle, his face a contorted mask of psychotic rage. He was holding a sawed-off shotgun, his eyes darting around the empty yard. Elias watched from above as the two groups converged in the center of the hall. The air was thick with tension, a single spark away from a conflagration. "Where is she, Arthur?" Vane screamed, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Where is my wife?" Arthur Thorne stood his ground, his face pale but composed. "I don't have her, Julian. Elias told me he was bringing her here to trade. He said you were the one who snatched her back at the wharf." The realization began to dawn on them at the same time. They looked up toward the rafters, but Elias was already moving. He dropped a series of flashbang grenades into the center of the hall, the blinding white light and deafening roar turning the space into a chaotic nightmare. "It's a setup!" someone shouted, and the first shot was fired. Elias didn't stay to watch the slaughter. He descended the back staircase, the sound of automatic gunfire echoing behind him like the roar of a dying beast. He had orchestrated the perfect storm, and the two most powerful men in the London underworld were currently tearing each other apart in the ruins of their own greed. As he reached his car, he saw a figure standing by the gate. It was Mickey, his face bruised, and one arm in a sling from the pub fight. He was holding a pistol, his hand shaking. "You think you're so smart, Elias," Mickey spat, his voice cracking. "You think you can just walk away?" Elias didn't even slow down. He looked at the young man who had betrayed him for a paycheck. "I already have, Mickey. You're the one still standing in the graveyard." He fired once, a clean shot that took Mickey in the shoulder, knocking him back into the shadows. Elias didn't finish him. He didn't have time. The police sirens were already wailing in the distance, a blue and red chorus that would arrive just in time to collect the bodies of Julian Vane and Arthur Thorne. Elias climbed into his car and sped away, the silhouette of the power station receding in his rearview mirror. The final gambit had been played, and the board was clear. By the time he reached the penthouse, the sun was beginning to peek over the horizon of June 2nd, 1994. He walked into the room to find Clara waiting by the window. She turned to him, her eyes searching his face for the verdict. "It's over," Elias said, his voice thick with exhaustion and a strange, hollow victory. "They're gone. All of them." He walked to her, and for the first time in their journey, he allowed himself to fully collapse into her embrace. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the heavy weight of the man he had become. But as they stood there watching the new dawn break over the river, Elias felt a cold prickle of unease. He had neutralized the firms and the monsters, but he had also invited the truth into the light. The dossiers he had sent to the Home Office were a double-edged sword, and the system that had created him was not known for its mercy. The loop remained open. They were free from the shadows of the wharf, but the light of the world carried its own set of dangers. Elias tightened his grip on Clara, knowing that the cost of their new life was a debt that might never be fully paid. The air on June 5, 1994, was thick with the scent of salt and diesel, a cocktail of industry and escape. Elias Thorne stood on the deck of the Vesper, a 60-foot vessel that had cost him a significant portion of his untraceable offshore accounts. He was dressed simply in a white linen shirt and dark trousers, the heavy tailored suits of his past life packed away in trunks below deck. His shoulder was still bandaged, a dull throb reminding him of the price he had paid, but his movements were fluid and purposeful. He watched the silhouette of the London skyline recede into the morning mist. The Tower Bridge, the Docklands, the steeples of the East End. They were no longer his territory. He had surrendered his crown, but he had kept his life, and he had kept his fortune. He had not renounced the wealth he had spent 15 years accumulating. He had simply relocated it. Clara emerged from the cabin, the early morning light catching the deep brown of her hair. She was wearing a simple sundress, her feet bare against the polished teak of the deck. She looked toward the horizon, where the grey of the river met the blue of the open sea. "Is it really over?" she asked, her voice carrying over the hum of the engines. Elias walked over to her, his large frame shielding her from the wind. He reached out, his hand finding the small of her back. The physical connection was a constant now, a grounding force that reminded them both of the reality they had built from the wreckage. "The firms are dead, Clara," Elias said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Arthur and Julian are gone, and Mickey is likely singing to the coppers to save his own skin. The dossiers I sent to the Home Office ensured that the system is too busy cleaning up its own mess to look for us. We're ghosts now." He turned her to face him, his hands framing her face. The violet in her eyes was clear now, free from the shadow of the man who had tried to buy her. The transformation in her was absolute. She was no longer a girl fleeing a wedding, but a woman who had seen the abyss and walked through it. "We have enough to live 10 lifetimes, Elias continued, his thumb stroking her cheekbones. "We have the houses in Spain, the accounts in Switzerland, but more than that, we have the silence." Clara leaned into him, her hands sliding up his chest to rest on his shoulders. The heat between them was a slow, steady burn, a sensual magnetism that had survived the rain of the shipyards and the fire of the power station. She pulled him down, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was no longer desperate, but filled with a quiet, powerful certainty. It was a deep, lingering contact, the kind that spoke of years to come rather than hours left. Her body molded to his, the soft curves of her frame pressing against the hard muscle of his chest. In that moment, on the deck of a boat moving toward the unknown, they weren't a gangster and a runaway. They were simply two people who had found a reason to keep breathing. "I used to think my life was just a series of debts," Clara whispered against his neck. "Debts to my father, debts to Vane. I thought I was just a coin being passed from one hand to another." "And now?" Elias asked. "Now I belong to myself," she said, looking him in the eye, "and I choose to be here, with you." Elias felt a lump form in his throat, a rare display of emotion from a man who had spent a decade and a half as a stone. He realized then that his own transformation was the most profound. He was no longer an enforcer of someone else's will. He was the architect of his own peace. The boat cleared the mouth of the river, the choppy waters of the English Channel opening up before them. The sun was fully up now, a brilliant gold coin hanging in a sky that was finally mercifully blue. Elias walked to the helm, his hand steady on the wheel. He set the course for the south, toward the warmth and the light. He knew the world hadn't changed. There would always be men like Vane and Thorne, and there would always be shadows in the alleys of the cities they left behind. But they were no longer part of that cycle. As the coast of England became a thin, dark line on the horizon, Elias looked back one last time. He thought about the rain on May 12th and the girl in the white silk dress. He thought about the blood on the cobblestones and the tiny pearl on his rug. Justice in their world was a rare thing, usually delivered at the end of a barrel, but they had found a different kind of justice, the justice of survival. They had taken the fragments of their broken lives and forged them into something new, something resilient. "Final destination?" Clara asked, stepping up beside him at the wheel. "Somewhere the rain doesn't feel like needles," Elias replied, a genuine smile touching his lips. The story of the London gangster and the runaway bride ended there, on the open sea, between the world they had destroyed and the life they were about to build. They carried their scars, their memories, and their wealth, but they carried them together. The lesson was simple, written in the wake of the boat as it sliced through the waves. Resilience is not just about standing your ground, it is about knowing when to burn the ground you stand on so you can find a better place to grow. The new dawn had arrived, and for the first time in 1994, the light didn't reveal a crime scene. It revealed a future.